Hello students, today we are going to discuss Elizabethan age. We will start discussing the literary features of the Elizabethan age. In order to understand any age, it is essential to know about the historical background of the country, the people, the social background, the political background. These things are reflected in the literature of the period. And therefore, when we discuss the features of the Elizabethan age, we shall definitely discuss these aspects so that we are clear about the features that are reflected in the literature of that period. As you can see on the slide, that the Elizabethan age began in 1550 and it continued till 1630. This was the period when the Elizabethan age is studied in English literature. This is the period when Queen Elizabeth ruled over England. Therefore, this age is known as the Elizabethan age. As I mentioned, Queen Elizabeth reigned over England. The two dominating features that act as the historical background are settlement and expansion. Let us understand what these two features are and how they played a vital role in influencing the literature that was written during the period of Queen Elizabeth. The first one, settlement. With the reign of Queen Elizabeth, as you can see, there was stability in politics, and the major fight between Scotland and England came to an end. Therefore, there was peace and the stability. These two things were very ideal for the growth of literature. When we look at the expansion part, we will find that this is a period where not only do you find the mental horizons, but the geographical horizons also widened during this period. What was the reason behind this? There was knowledge that was coming in from all sides, the east, and the new world was opening in the west. The voyagers who had moved into England, they brought with them a lot of material. They were intellectual treasures, and these things did have an impact on English literature. It is also essential to go back a little to understand the previous period, because when a new age sets in, it will have the reminiscence, the remains of the past age. And we know that in English literature, Greek, Latin are very much important classical languages which had entered into the English language. It had influenced the English language. It had influenced the literature of that language. But with these great voyages, a lot of material and intellectual treasures came into England, and this definitely had an impact on the literature written during the Elizabethan age. Since we are required to discuss about the literary features of the age, as you know that the previous age there was a lot of rigidity, the kind of adherence to the traditions. These things were definitely seen in the previous age. Now the change, when it comes, you will definitely find that it had an impact mainly because of the freedom that people had. When we talk about the literary features of the Elizabethan age, we have to understand that there are 7 striking features that are reflected in the literature of this period. The first one that you can see, we will just go through the different ages first, features first, and then we will specifically discuss each and every feature of the age. The first one being the new classicism. What do you mean by the new classicism? Classicism was already there. There was a lot of study of the classical texts, classical language. Latin, as we know, was very widely used. But now with the new age, new classicism, it was returned to the Greek literature. So there is a lot of Greek literature which has been imitated, which has been produced in English literature through various writers who were greatly influenced by the great Greek experts. Therefore, we call it as the new classicism. We can also look at the next literary feature, which talks about abundance of output. This period is the most vibrant period. This is the richest period of English literature, as you will find that a lot of works were written, a lot of writers were born, great writers were born, and Shakespeare, who is synonymous with English literature, also wrote during this period. We'll have a look at the new Romanticism with the age. This is another feature which you can see. We will discuss about it in length. Drama was at its best. All the best English plays were written during this period. And Shakespeare, as I mentioned earlier, belonged to this age, and therefore he enriched the English literature with his literary production. Poetry is another genre which got equal importance during this phase. This period is also known as a nest of singing birds, because a lot of good poets with lyrical quality in the poetry wrote during this period. It's not only drama or poetry that got importance or significance during this period. You will find a lot of prose was written during this period. The another major important feature is that till then there was Scottish literature which appeared, but there is a clear disappearance of the Scottish literature after the war between England and Scotland came to an end. Let's have a look at the next slide, where we will now focus on each and every feature of Elizabethanage. The first being the new classicism. You've all heard the word Renaissance. Renaissance is a kind of an experience. It's reawakening. It's a French word, rebirth, reawakening, which had a lot of influence on the literature of the Elizabethan age. As I mentioned earlier, with lot of people coming to England, with the voyagers coming to England, bringing with them a lot of material, literary material were also brought. And these things definitely brought a very positive impact on the English literature which was produced. Now we call it new classicism. Till then, Latin was the predominant classical language which was even taught and learnt by the people of England. There is a shift that you can see, that there is a revival in the study of Greek during this period. Now, because of this, a lot of Greek works were reproduced in English, and you will find some of the finest works. Even the dramatist Shakespeare, who wrote a lot of plays which had a kind of influence of the Greek plays, the tragedy form which came into existence. there is a lot of similarity between the Shakespearean tragedy and the Greek tragedy. We look at the next point, which talks about the passion for classical learning. This was something which was very evident in the university wits, the 7 great scholars who studied from the University of Cambridge and Oxford, who started writing, unlike Shakespeare, who was not so learned. Their fascination or their passion for learning the classical languages and bringing in literature from the other classical languages into English made a major feature which can be reflected in the works of this period. Therefore, university wits play a very major role. You will find the influx of Greek and Latin in English language. That's why when we read a text written during the Elizabethanage, you will find not only that the material, the matter, the substance of Greek and Latin, but you will also find words, Greek words and Latin words, which made entry into English language. Sorry. Benefit of classical influence on English language. Now, this is how, when we talk about the classical influence on the works of the Elizabethanage, you will find that these kinds of influences, not only the language but also the literature of the classical languages, did impact or did find a place in the English literature of that period. Now we look at the next feature. Other than the influence of classical language, and specifically the Greek language, you will find that there was an abundance of output in the literature written during this period. What was the reason behind this? As I said, there was stability after the war between the Scotland and England came to an end, and Queen Elizabeth ruled over England, and she favored the growth of English literature. So, political situation of a country is reflected in the growth of the literature of that country. You will find a lot of new things coming up. Pamphlets were written, treatises were written, they were freely written, and there was no control over the writings. There was ultimate freedom to the writers to write. After we discussed about the new classicism and the abundance of output, we now would like to discuss about the new Romanticism which came about. There was a quest for knowing something about the remote, the wonderful, the beautiful things of life which were reflected in the literature of this period. You will also find when a new age is being established, there is a lot of rebellion for the past, for the old. So there was a revolt against the past. And you will also find that there's a resolute spirit of adventure. When there was freedom, people had free hand, there were no rules to bind them, they were free to experiment and have their own adventure, the spirit of adventure, which was encouraged, and this spirit of adventure was reflected in the literature of this period. When new things are being written, when new topics are being highlighted in the literature, obviously there is a freshness in the material, in the content, in the subject which were discussed during this period. And there was this buoyant spirit during this period. Therefore, we call this, because there were a lot of young writers who came ahead and started experimenting with different styles. They started writing different genres, and therefore you will find that ardent youth, you call it as the ardent youth of English literature. The Elizabethanage is therefore very youthful, very buoyant, full of spirit of adventure, breaking from the traditional spirit. The next feature that we can discuss So we already discussed the new Classicism, we discussed the new Romanticism, we discussed the abundance of output. Now we can talk about the drama form. Drama form was at its best, as I mentioned earlier, during the Elizabethan age. There were a lot of theatres. These plays were being performed in theatres, and this was the only source of entertainment for the people of this age. Renaissance drama came into existence. The two major writers that I would like to mention at this point of time are Shakespeare and Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare. These two writers dominated this period, and specifically Shakespeare dominated or ruled this age. You can see that in the age of drama, a lot of things were being experimented. And what were they? They wrote comedies, there was humor in the drama, there were tragedies, great tragedies were written. Soliloquy was introduced in a play. There was this use of supernatural. You will find that in the plays of Shakespeare, ghosts do appear. You also find dramatic romances which were being performed in theatres and which was widely appreciated by the audience, and therefore they were written again and again, and you will find some of the best dramatic romances by William Shakespeare. After having discussed drama, we would definitely like to talk about the criticism part. Critical works were also written during this period. In 1579, Gosson's School of Abuse was published, and there was this rebellion against the drama form specifically, or poetry form, for literature in fact. And Sidney's reply to Apology of Poetry, with his Apology of Poetry, which was published in 1580, was the reply to Gosson's School of Abuse. Now this is the period when Shakespeare's dramatic art reaches its pinnacle. Apart from that, when we talk about poetry, because as I mentioned earlier, Elizabethanage was also known as the nest of singing birds, because lot of good poetries were written. The lyrical quality of the poetries were of very high quality. What kind of poetries were written? Let us have a look at that. Sonnets were written during this period. Elizabethan lyrics and songs were quite popular, were very lyrical, were musical. Edmund Spencer's name need to be mentioned here for his passionate kind of writing, passionate poetries, lyrical quality of his poetry, and also the classical pastoral models which were being rewritten during this period. Allegorical devices were also used. You will also find that amidst these kind of lyrical quality, there was also revolt against this easy and fluent style of writing. You will also see that these kind of poems were very freely written, easily written. It had a very fluent style. It was very use of simple language because people could easily understand them. As we know that humanism is a very important feature which did have an impact on the literature of this period. But at this point of time, you will also find another writer who revolted against this easy and fluent style, who came and who rather dominated. His domination could be rather visible in the next age, but then he definitely made a beginning with the Elizabethanage. John Donne needs to be mentioned here, who specialized in imagery and satirical kind of writings. So Thomas Yatt, Henry Howard, Thomas Sackville and Michael Drayton were some of the eminent poets of those period. So we discussed a lot of other features, but did you notice that Elizabethan age also is an age where a lot of prose writings were published. There were fictional proses, there were non-fictional proses, there were navigational writings, because as I said, there were a lot of voyages, a lot of travelers who came to England, and they used to share their experiences, real life experiences, in the form of prose writings, and therefore navigational writings were also quite prominently written during this period. You will also see historical writings being written. Let me mention Shakespeare's Henry V, Richard II. These were some of the historical dramas, plays which he had written. Philip Sidney's Arcadia is also a lot of poetry, lyrics in this work, but then it's a very intense prose romance. What becomes obvious in the literature of this period is Latin tradition had begun to disappear. English prose acquires universal appeal now. When you say universal appeal, maximum number of people could read, comprehend, and appreciate the literature of this period. It was not necessary that you need to be a scholar to be able to comprehend the writings. Those were published during the Elizabethan age. Some of the writers who wrote prose were Thomas Lodge, Nash, Roger Ascham. And you will also figure that essays were written. The emergence of essay as a form, Bacon's essay, so this is one of the richest phase of English literature. We call it the most treasured age. Why? Because as you have noticed that all these different kinds of genres were written, they were experimented during this period. So criticism was also not an exception here. You will find that Gossen's School of Abuse, Sidney's Apology for Poetry, Shelley's Defense of Poetry, Webb's Discourse of English Poetry, and Samuel Daniel's Defense of Rhythm. These were some of the critical works which were written. So there were a lot of deliberations taking place during this age. There was a lot of discussions with specific reference to the literature of that period. Now, before we try to conclude, I would like to sum up the entire features that we discussed today of the Elizabethan age. As we discussed earlier, we have to talk about the growth of humanism, because that is one thing which had a very positive impact on the literature of this period. What you mean by humanism is there was a lot of freedom, there was a lot of liberal thinking which was encouraged during this period. So when there is freedom, there are new ideas, new subjects which are being discussed and written about. New interests, people were allowed. They did not have to stick to the classical mode or classical rules. They were free to express their thoughts and experiences in the words as simple as they could. Aesthetic sensitiveness is something which came about as a result of humanism, as a result of the free thoughts being expressed. Separated literature and art from the religious authority. So there was no kind of a control over the writings. As I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of freedom being exercised by the writers, and therefore they could write without any kind of fear. They wrote their minds, and therefore it was widely accepted. So if we wish to go back and discuss, so that you can at least remember the major features of the Elizabethan age, you will find that a lot of works were written. That is why we say abundance of output. The works that were written included poetry, drama, critical works, that is criticism. We also find experimentation being done. In the prose writings, you will find not only that fictional and non-fictional works were written, but they also included essays. Essays were written. There's a new kind of prosaic writing which was introduced and developed and rather, which was encouraged, was navigational writings. As I mentioned, the voyagers who came to England, who traveled to England from various parts, would share their experiences through these writings, and therefore navigational writings was something which came into existence during this period. Some of the best writers were produced during the Elizabethan age. Freedom matters a lot to people, and owing to this freedom, you will find that with free minds, the writers who were not supposed to, who did not have to rather get tied down by certain rules and regulations, or rather follow certain traditions of writing, had absolute freedom of thought. They could think and write, they could feel and write, they could share their experiences, and therefore these features are very, very important while you study the works written during the Elizabethan age. Any writers that you read belonging to the Elizabethan age, you will have to keep in mind these 7 striking features that can be visible in their writings. Even if you're dealing with a drama written during the Elizabethan age, you can very clearly see that there was a poetical quality, there were poetries written, there were soliloquies written. As I said, that was something new which was introduced in the Elizabethan age, in the dramas of the Elizabethan age. The soliloquies were very popular. Sonnets were very popular when we talk about the poetry form. Lot of experimentation took place even with the poetry form written during the Elizabethan age. And therefore sonnets, the Petrarchan sonnets, definitely influenced Shakespeare, who came up with the Shakespearean sonnets. When we discuss the different second part of the Elizabethan age, we will definitely try to identify the features that we have studied here. For your reference, these points were discussed. It was based on the text. The text is History of English Literature by Edward Albert. Now this text is prescribed by Gujarat University, and therefore the entire presentation was based on this, so that while you read the text, you will be able to follow each and every aspect that were discussed in today's class. The other book which you can read is A History of English Literature. It's by Dr. Sharad Rajimwale. It's written by an Indian author, and therefore it becomes easier for students who study in remote places, in Mofussil colleges, who can definitely understand the language, which is more simplified language, and it's very in a very organized manner these points are explained, and you will also understand the history in detail, in-depth study of the literature, because today we simply discussed about the literary features of the Elizabethan age. Now, like any literature, when you study, it's very, very important to understand, to comprehend the features, the literary features of the age, because only then and then you will be able to appreciate the text that you will be studying of that particular period. You need to understand the politics, the political background, the historical background, and the social background of that country, of that period, because these things are definitely discussed or reflected in the literature of that period. The English literature written during the Elizabethan age had lot of features. It's the most widely acclaimed period of English literature because of the rich resources that it produced. And there was something for everyone. Somebody who loved poetry had poetry as a form. A lot of poetries, good poetries were written during this period with a lot of lyrical quality in it. There were also dramas, as I said, the only source of entertainment for the people of this age. These plays were written with a specific aim to be produced or to be performed in a theatre. And therefore, these plays also, as I said, the influence of the new classicism when we talked about, we are definitely talking about the Greek influence which the works had, which were written during this period. And the Greek influence, to the maximum you will find that the Greek influence had an impact on the dramas written during this period. And Shakespearean dramas is the best example of this kind of, the new classicism. As you can see, the Greek plays were not exactly imitated, but they were a source of inspiration to the writers, and in particular Shakespeare is one of them, who was greatly inspired by these writings, and he tried to incorporate them in his plays. Those were written. So we discussed at length today the literary features of the Elizabethan age, which includes not only poetry, prose writings, drama, but it also has different kinds of prose writings. The prose writings includes navigational writing, as I mentioned, and try to understand this and then study the texts that were written during this period, and you will definitely find that the features are somewhere visible in the writings. They are reflected in the writings that were written during this period. To understand the text better, it is very, very important to understand the literary features of the particular age. It's very important to understand the political background, the social background of the place where the literature is being produced. And that is how these literary features will help you understand the text better, because since we study in India, we are not familiar with the politics or the history or the social condition of the country, of England in particular. And it is here that when you study these things, you have more idea about what the literature is trying to convey, what message the literature of Elizabethan age conveys to the readers. Thank you.